Hello students, ready to start the lecture for Chapter 11, Global Logistics and quote-unquote the case. This is the battery-operated toothbrush case that's been posted now for a couple of weeks. I don't think anybody's had the time to seriously look at it. Now it's time to get serious about it. It's due on August the 9th. I thought it made sense to change things up a little bit from the syllabus and get into the Global Logistics Chapter 11, followed by more information about the case and seeing how the information in this chapter can help you come up with a solution for the case so that you can get the full point value of 100 points. You'll also notice that you don't see my smiling face. I'm having problems with the video portion, so I even have problems with the audio. I have already recorded 30 minutes and none of it was captured, so I'm hopeful this will work to your satisfaction and mine. So let us proceed with the first slide on global logistics, and that is the short version of global. And it looks like not only do we have the short version of global, but we've got slides that are getting bigger and better that you can't see all of what's indicated. So we just fixed that. Look, you have two options when you're talking about global logistics. Are you an exporter or are you an importer? When you export as a US-based company, you do that to increase sales revenue. And the nice thing about that from a supply chain perspective is that in most instances, not always, you can ship it and forget it. Somebody else's problem once it gets on the boat to do all the tracking and tracing and the supply for the locations in the country where the product is destined. Import, that's a different story. In that instance, we, the supply chain in the US, we're dealing with the headaches of all of the supply chain activities, from sourcing the product overseas and getting it into the US on a timely, and that has quotes around that, basis. And why is importing done of finished goods and materials? Well, it's part of our TLLC formula, total lease landed cost. And for that, our supply chain responsibility has, as I call, cradle to grave responsibility from the beginning to the end. Unlike in exporting, where you can often just wash your hands as the product gets on the ocean container gets on the ship, bye-bye, farewell, good luck, see you later. It ain't that way with the import side. Now, what makes global supply chain so challenging, and you're going to see in this chapter, there are a million reasons, but one I can't help but dismiss, that one that I want to focus on, is the differences in culture. There's a different work ethic, a different pace of work. Often when you're dealing with non-native speakers, they understand book English, but they don't understand idioms and analogies, and often the way we Americans are trying to communicate, if this is your first language. If it's your second language, you probably have some sympathy and understanding for those on the other end. But for me, I'm not a polyglot. I think that means capable of speaking many languages. I struggle with English, and that's it. And then there are trust issues as well. Different cultures often lead to suspicions, and one way to mitigate the trust is to have a frequent presence at the supply locations overseas that are producing the products or the materials that you're using. And you'll see in the slide we talk about hidden costs, and travel costs are one of those, and they could very well be a factor in your solution for the supply chain case. I've said too much. We'll move away from that and get back on task with slide number 2 that we have in front of us. And in the slide, you'll see the next bullet point is it's a challenging inventory model. You remember our partes, trace partes of inventory, production cycle, and look at this. Whoops. Do I have them out of order? I've got in transit second and safety stock third. No, I don't have them out of order because now safety stocks are affected by the variation in transit time. So let's take a look at each of these three components. Production cycle, it's typical that in an overseas supply situation, you're given one production cycle per month. This is when the plant this week is going to run products for your company. And you're hopeful that that supplier will produce when scheduled. Often they do not. There goes that trust issue again. Did somebody else give them a crinkled handshake to take your place in the production schedule? And as a result, you've been pushed out for another 2 weeks, but you desperately need the product. So this is why companies often have on-site personnel in quality, in, we'll call it supply planning, presence at the plant, and then frequent visits by the parent company's logistics organization, supply chain organization, R&D, marketing often get involved. So there's a constant parade for many companies going in and out of the overseas supply locations, as well as having on-site presence. So I kept the production cycle similar to the same model that we have for US-based products that are made once a month. If it's made once a month, you remember in the sawtooth, that's the peak, but we take the middle of that, the average, which is what? Half, which is what? 2 weeks of supply. Now comes the fun part. All the variation around shipping on the water. Ocean vessels from China and Europe, they'll quote you 4 weeks, but it's more like 5. And then when the product lands in the US, it's often transferred to an intermodal shipment. The container that is on the boat gets picked up, put on a rail car. That adds another week of in transit. So we're talking about 6 weeks on average. In the case, I think I used 7. 6, 7, same thing. Now safety stocks, they link to the two above items. That's why I made that last. You remember on production cycles, we make safety stock to cover sales variation, the peak of the production cycle. And that's what? 4 weeks of supply. There's also in-transit variation. Even with 5 weeks, I've seen many, many instances of the in-transits taking 6 and 7 weeks. So we'll put another 2 weeks of supply in safety stock to cover the variation in transit. So we have 6 weeks of supply in total, just as we do for in transit, 6 and 2 weeks of supply for production cycle. Sum that all up, and what do you have? 6, 6, and 2, 14 weeks of supply. On a 7-day week, we're talking about 98 days. Hey, let's just call it 100 among friends. 100 days into 365 days a year. We've got 3.6 inventory turns per year. That is horrible. But that's what you buy into on a total lease landed cost basis for, shall we call it, stable products that are sourced from overseas. The exception to this would be a company like Apple Computer. And I've mentioned this earlier in the case that I almost fainted when one of our students did inventory turns for Apple. I had no idea. They've got 2 days supply, maybe 3, if you round it that way. I was shocked because I know they make everything overseas. And doesn't the overseas model, we just went through it, say, no, they've got 14 weeks of supply. They only have 3.5 inventory turns, 3.6. So what's going on here? What Apple does, in order to break that 14-week cycle, is they make to order at their overseas factories, mostly in China, and then they air freight the product directly to the consumer or to the store that has placed the order. So they willingly pay the premium in air freight, which in our business case I'm saying is 15 times greater than ocean, and that's a realistic number. Apple will willingly pay that upcharge in air freight. But guess who's paying for that? You and I are, when they price that iPhone, pricing partly based on demand by consumers and to make sure it covers costs. So you're paying $600 for an iPhone, I believe, versus $20 in our business case for a battery operated toothbrush. So the battery operated toothbrush, say that 3 times fast, uses the 14-week model to keep costs low. Apple, due to the high probability of obsolescence, that today's new iPhone will be an antique in 6 months, they cannot afford to have 14 weeks of inventory in their system to cover what's mostly driven by that long in-transit time from the overseas factories to the United States. So that's how they do it. And they're kind of an exception to the 14-week cycle. So we've mentioned it, and now we can do an F&F, file and forget, because for the 14-week will be our model. Since we are focused primarily on consumer packaged goods, and CPG does not have the margins to be able to air freight products around the world. So let's go back to export versus import versus domestic. Export, that usually means, as we said a couple of minutes ago, we ship and forget, because the receiver in most instances worries about, has responsibility for the tracking, the tracing of the shipment, the documentation to get it into the country and to its ultimate destination. The United States is now a net importer of goods. And I was surprised the ratios were this close. 60% of the sum of import and export, 60% are imported and 40% are exported. I thought it was more like 80-20, maybe even 90-10. So I was very surprised it was this close. But given that our business case is about importing, and that is the majority of the activity, 50% more than export, I've rationalized that that will be our Chapter 11 focus. We're not going to spend time on exporting. It's not done as frequently as importing, and it doesn't tie into the case. So I'm assuming that you'll be working for, or do work for, a U.S. company that does more importing than exporting. That is going to be the focus for this lecture and this chapter. There are other slides that get into exporting that I'm not going to give an audio on, and you're welcome to look at that on your own, but I'm not going to cover that in the exam either. So just the slides with the audio will be the slides, and there are about 30 of them that are the focus for the exam. And they also include slides on the business case as well. Now, why is it that the U.S. is importing more goods than it exports? Well, it's because we don't make much stuff in the U.S. anymore. When I was a kid, manufacturing was king in the United States. But look at all the automobiles that are imported. So for every import of an automobile, that's a car that would have been made in the U.S. 40 years ago. So little by little, due to the high cost of labor, the U.S. is losing its manufacturing base. So how do you correct that? Well, the last bullet is through automation in U.S. factories to replace the high-cost labor with machines. That's what's necessary for U.S.-based companies to be able to produce in the U.S. and have low costs. The other option is to import low-cost goods from overseas. So those are the two buttons you push as you're looking at driving down costs in order to have the total least landed cost for your product. Now, the question in much of this lecture, and basically for the business case, is, I feel like Shakespeare, to be or not to be, it's to import or not. And to answer that, you do total least landed cost analysis to determine if importing is a true benefit versus domestic manufacturing. And there's an example of that and those costs in slide 22, and it is touched at, not in great detail, but enough for you to be able to work the arithmetic for the most part in the business case. And I purposely left things out so that your creative juices can flow in the business case to look for other low-cost options. And when total least landed cost analysis is done, you should include any significant quote-unquote hidden costs that aren't normally part of the total least landed costs. Hint, hint, we talked about all that travel expense to have people constantly in the air going to the overseas factories. So that's something that can sway a decision about where products should be sourced that's never thought of up front, or rarely thought of up front when those decisions are being made. And of course, you cannot assume that you're always going to ship 100% of the product by water. That's not realistic. In our business case, I think I indicated somewhere around 20 to 25% of product is air freighted on the battery operated toothbrushes every year. And no matter how the company, no matter how many times the company tries its best to eliminate that expense, it shows up year after year after year. Why don't we take a little break at this point, and then I'm going to move into slide 6 with a global supply chain overview, and I'm keeping my fingers crossed that the audio at least worked for this part of the lecture, knowing that the video has not.